On the sunny afternoon of October 2nd, 1920, King Alexander of Greece lay writhing in the dust of his private garden at Tatoy Palace. The air smelled of pine resin and the metallic tang of fresh blood. His riding breeches were shredded, soaked in red. His leg was a mangled mess of torn flesh and deep, jagged puncture marks. He hadn't been struck by an assassin's bullet. He hadn't been blown up by a revolutionary's bomb. The king of the Hellenes, the man who had just triumphantly expanded his empire across the Aegean Sea, had just lost a vicious, chaotic street fight with a pet monkey. As his servants rushed to help him, pulling the snarling animal away, Alexander likely felt a wave of intense shame. He tried to stand up. He tried to laugh it off. He thought this was just a humiliating, ridiculous accident, a story he would tell at dinner parties. But he was wrong. He had no idea that he was already a dead man walking. He had no idea that the bacteria swarming deep inside those puncture wounds were a ticking time bomb. And he certainly couldn't have known that the blood pooling around his boots was the first drop in a river of death. That single infected bite was about to trigger a geopolitical chain reaction that would burn the ancient city of Smyrna to the ground, topple governments in Athens and London, and slaughter 250,000 innocent people. This is the story of a careless king, a forbidden love, and the most expensive animal bite in human history. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, Athens was a dusty, noisy, growing capital. It was a city of heat and stone, struggling to modernize. But just 17 miles to the north, on the slopes of Mount Parnitha, lay a different world. Tatoy was the private sanctuary of the Greek royal family. Imagine 10,000 acres of dense, fragrant pine forest and ancient oak trees. The air here was thinner, cooler, smelling of resin and wild thyme. It was a working estate with vineyards producing royal wine, stables full of horses, and a farm that supplied the palace kitchens. Buried deep within these woods was a comfortable, unpretentious palace that felt more like a grand country cottage than a seat of power. It was here, on August 1st, 1893, that Prince Alexander was born. He was the second son of Crown Prince Constantine and Crown Princess Sophia. His birth was celebrated with the usual gun salutes and church bells, but in the strict hierarchy of royalty, being the second son implies a very specific destiny. In the crude shorthand of aristocracy, the first son is the heir, and the second son is the spare. His older brother George was the serious one. George was the future king. From the moment he could walk, George was being prepped for the throne, tutored in constitutional law, military strategy, and the heavy burden of duty. Alexander, or Alec as the family called him, had a different path. He was the backup. And like many backups in royal history, this gave him a dangerous amount of freedom. By all accounts, the young Alexander was the golden boy of the family. He was undeniably handsome, inheriting the classic photogenic looks of the Danish and Russian royal lines from which his father descended. But he had a spark that his older brother lacked. He was athletic, reckless, and charmingly approachable. While George was in the library studying statecraft, Alexander was outside. He was obsessed with the new mechanical wonders of the age. The early 20th century was the dawn of the automobile, and Alexander fell in love with speed. He was a petrol head before the term existed. He would acquire some of the earliest cars imported into Greece and terrorize the goats and farmers on the winding dirt roads around Tatoy, driving with a heavy foot and a wide grin. He wasn't an intellectual. He found politics boring and court etiquette stifling. He was a man of the physical world. He loved football, he loved tennis, and he loved animals. He was rarely seen without a dog at his heels. He had a natural, easy charisma that made him popular with the palace staff and the common soldiers he would later serve with. He didn't have the stiff Germanic haughtiness that people sometimes sensed in his mother, Sophia, because her bloodline is the first crucial ingredient in the explosive cocktail of Greek politics. Princess Sophia wasn't just any princess. She was a Prussian princess. She was the sister of Kaiser Wilhelm II, the Emperor of Germany. In 1900, this was a prestigious connection. But as the years ticked closer to 1914, having the German Kaiser's sister as your future queen would become a massive political liability for Greece. It meant that Alexander grew up in a household that was culturally split. His father, Constantine, was the Greek hero, the leader of the army. His mother was the connection to Berlin, to the disciplined militarism of Germany. Alexander, however, seemed to float above these geopolitical tensions. He was just a young prince enjoying the privileges of his station without the crushing responsibility. He assumed his life would be a comfortable one, a career in the military, perhaps a marriage to a minor European princess, and long summers at Tatoy driving his cars. He had no idea that the world was about to break. By the time Alexander was in his early 20s, around 1915, Greece was tearing itself apart in a conflict known as the national schism. Alexander is just a guy who got bit by a monkey. With the schism, he becomes the linchpin of a tragedy. Imagine a country with two heads. On one side, you had the royalists led by Alexander's father, King Constantine I. Constantine was a war hero. He had led the Greek armies to glorious victories in the Balkan Wars of 1912 and 1913, doubling the size of Greece. The soldiers adored him. The conservative rural population saw him as a godfather figure. He was the eagle's son. King Constantine believed that Greece was a small, exhausted nation. He looked at the brewing storm of World War I, where Britain, France, and Russia were lining up against Germany and Austria-Hungary, and he said, no. He believed Greece's only hope for survival was strict neutrality. He knew the German army was the most powerful on earth, and he didn't want Greece to be crushed by it. On the other side, you had the liberals, led by one of the most charismatic and formidable politicians of the 20th century, Eleftherios Venizelos. Venizelos was everything Constantine was not. He was a visionary, a revolutionary, a man of fire and rhetoric. He wore round wire-rimmed glasses and possessed a white beard that made him look like a biblical prophet. Venizelos believed that neutrality was cowardice. He believed that Greece's destiny was to revive the glories of the ancient Byzantine Empire. He dreamed of the Megali idea, a Greece that spanned 2 continents and 5 seas, reclaiming the ancient Greek lands in Asia Minor from the crumbling Ottoman Empire. Venizelos knew he couldn't do this alone. He needed powerful friends. He was totally committed to the Entente, the alliance of Britain and France. He believed that if Greece fought for the Allies would reward Greece with massive new territories. So you have the king who wants peace and neutrality. You have the prime minister who wants war and expansion. It was an impossible situation. The country split down the middle. In Athens, officers loyal to the king would cross the street to avoid saluting officers loyal to Venizelos. Coffee shops became political battlegrounds. Alexander, the Playboy Prince, watched this from the sidelines. He was an officer in the army, serving in the artillery, but he tried to stay out of the venomous arguments consuming his family. He saw the stress eating away at his father. He saw the hatred directed at his mother, Queen Sophia, whom the Venizelist press called the German woman, accusing her of sending Greek state secrets to her brother, the Kaiser. Then the First World War exploded. By 1916, the national schism had turned into an actual division of the state. Venizelos, frustrated by the king's refusal to join the war, essentially started a revolution. He fled Athens and set up a rival government in the northern city of Thessaloniki. Now, Greece literally had two governments. The king controlled the south, Venizelos controlled the north, and Venizelos had the backing of the British and French fleets. This is where the story begins to close in on Alexander like a vice. The Allies were losing patience with King Constantine. They were fighting a desperate war against Germany, and they looked at the map and saw Greece as a vital strategic point. They needed the Greek harbors. They needed the Greek army. And standing in their way was this obstinate king with a German wife. The Allied propaganda machine went into overdrive. They painted King Constantine as a puppet of Germany, a traitor to civilization. They blockaded southern Greece. Food became scarce in Athens. People were starving. The royal family could look out the windows of the palace and see the gray silhouettes of French warships in the Saronic Gulf, their guns pointed at the capital. It was a terrifying time to be a royal. In Russia, the Tsar, their cousin, was losing his grip on power. Monarchies were crumbling. Alexander, who just wanted to drive his cars and flirt with pretty girls, was watching his entire world disintegrate. The breaking point came in June 1917. The Allies had had enough. The French High Commissioner, Jeanneret, arrived in Athens with a simple, brutal ultimatum. King Constantine must abdicate. He must leave Greece immediately. If he refused, the French troops would land and Athens would be bombarded. But the Allies had a problem. They couldn't just abolish the monarchy. The British royal family wouldn't like that. They needed a puppet king, a figurehead. They couldn't accept Constantine. They couldn't accept the crown prince, George. George was too much like his father, too proud, too pro-German, too experienced. He had been trained to rule, and the last thing the Allies wanted was a ruler. They wanted a rubber stamp. So the French and British diplomats looked down the line of succession. They skipped the father. They skipped the older brother. And their eyes landed on the 23-year-old spare. They looked at Alexander. They saw a young man who had never given a political speech, a man who was known for his love of sports cars, not statutes, a man who seemed malleable, unintelligent, and weak. He will do, the diplomats decided. He will be our king. The scene in the palace on June 11, 1917, was one of Shakespearean tragedy. King Constantine gathered his family to tell them the news. He would not fight. To save his people from starvation and bombardment, he would leave. He and the crown prince George would go into exile, but Alexander had to stay. When his father told him that he was to be the new king, Alexander broke down. He wept. He physically recoiled from the idea. You have to understand, for a royal prince, taking the throne while your father and older brother are still alive and capable is a sin. It is a violation of the natural order. It felt like theft. It felt like betrayal. I cannot do it, Alexander protested. It belongs to George. But the logic was cold and hard. If Alexander refused, the Allies might abolish the monarchy entirely. He was the only thing standing between his dynasty and total oblivion. He had to sacrifice himself to save the throne for his family's eventual return. The departure was heartbreaking. A back door was used to avoid the crowds. Alexander stood on the steps of the Tatoy palace or the royal yacht, watching the cars carry away everyone he loved. His father, his mother, his brother, his sisters, all leaving for Switzerland. He was left behind, alone. At 9 a.m. the next morning, Alexander took the oath of office in the ballroom of the royal palace in Athens. He looked shell-shocked. He was wearing his military uniform, but he looked less like a king and more like a prisoner of war. And in every meaningful sense, that is exactly what he was. Prime Minister Venizelos returned to Athens in triumph, riding behind the bayonets of the French army. The rival government of the north moved into Athens. The king's loyal staff were fired. The palace was purged. Alexander found himself trapped in a large, echoing palace surrounded by strangers. Every servant, every guard, every secretary was a Venizelist appointee. They were spies. If Alexander made a phone call, someone was listening. If he wrote a letter to his father in Switzerland, it was opened, read, and often destroyed. He was the king of the Hellenes, yet he wasn't allowed to decide what he had for dinner without approval. He was trotted out for parades, forced to read speeches written by Venizelos, forced to review troops who were about to be sent to die in a war his father had tried to avoid. He was 24 years old, isolated, depressed, and deeply angry. He drove his motorcycles and cars recklessly fast through the Athens streets, terrified pedestrians diving out of the way. It was a death wish, acted out in burning rubber. He wrote to his father, "I feel like a usurper. I sit on your throne, but I am just keeping it warm for you." But in this darkness, in this golden cage of a life, Alexander found one single ray of light, a secret, something that gave him a reason to wake up in the morning, but something that would also lead him into direct conflict with the rigid rules of his existence. He was in love, and he was in love with the wrong woman. Her name was Aspasia Manos. This romance would become the emotional heart of his tragedy. It was a love strong enough to defy a prime minister, strong enough to break royal protocol, but ultimately, tragically, not strong enough to save him from the twist of fate waiting in the garden. This romance is not just a footnote in history. It is the emotional engine of the entire tragedy. It explains why Alexander was at Tatoy that fateful day. In the rigid, snobbish world of early 20th century European royalty, there was an unwritten rule: blue blood marries blue blood. Kings did not marry for love. They married for treaties. They married to secure borders or to mix gene pools with the ruling houses of Germany, Russia, Britain, or Scandinavia. A king of Greece was expected to find a nice princess from Denmark or a grand duchess from Russia. He was certainly not expected to marry the daughter of a mere colonel. Aspasia Manos was born in Athens in 1896. She was a commoner, but she wasn't exactly a peasant. She came from an old distinguished Phanariot family, aristocrats who had served the Ottoman court in Constantinople for centuries before moving to independent Greece. Her father, Colonel Petros Manos, was the master of the horse to the king, a highly respected military officer. Aspasia had grown up on the periphery of the royal circle. As a child, she had played with Alexander and his brothers, but as she grew into a woman, the dynamic changed. By 1915, Aspasia was widely considered one of the most beautiful women in Athens. Photographs from the time show a woman with dark, soulful eyes, elegant features, and a poise that commanded attention. She was intelligent, educated in France and Switzerland, and possessed a quiet strength that contrasted with Alexander's impulsive nature. Alexander fell for her hard. It started in 1915, 2 years before he became king, at a dinner party given by the Theodore Ypsilantis, a court official. Alexander, then just a prince, saw Aspasia across the room. He was captivated. He began to pursue her with the single-minded focus he usually reserved for his sports cars. But Aspasia was not easy to catch. She knew the rules. She knew that a prince could not seriously court a colonel's daughter. She knew that for men like Alexander, women like her were usually destined to be mistresses, not wives. And Aspasia Manos had absolutely no intention of being anyone's mistress. She resisted him, and as is often the case, her resistance only made Alexander more determined. He followed her to the island of Sepsis where she vacationed. He wrote her letters. He charmed her mother. Slowly she realized that this wasn't just a royal fling. Alexander was lonely. He was misunderstood by his stiff Germanic mother, and he saw in Aspasia something he couldn't find in the royal courts of Europe, a soulmate, someone who was actually Greek. When Alexander was forced onto the throne in 1917, their relationship shifted from a flirtation to a lifeline. Surrounded by enemies in his own palace, Aspasia became the only person he could trust. But now that he was king, the stakes were infinitely higher. For the first 2 years of his reign, Alexander and Aspasia lived a life of subterfuge that would make a spy proud. They couldn't be seen together in public. The optics were impossible. The royalist aristocracy, the friends of his exiled father, hated Aspasia because they saw her family as too close to the Venizelist liberals. The Venizelist government, on the other hand, watched the king like a hawk, looking for any sign of scandal to use against him. So they met in the shadows. Alexander would slip out of the palace in disguise, driving his own car to meet her at the houses of trusted friends. They would take long walks in the secluded woods of Tatoy, far from the prying eyes of Athens. The letters exchanged during this period reveal profound anguish. Alexander writes to her with the desperation of a drowning man. He tells her that he hates his job, that he hates the prime minister, and that she is the only bright spot in his wretched existence. He made her a promise he would marry her. This was a radical idea. In the history of the Greek dynasty, no king had ever married a native Greek. They had always imported their queens. For Alexander to marry Aspasia was a statement of independence. It was a way of saying, I may be a puppet in parliament, but I am the master of my own heart. But there was a massive legal hurdle. The Greek constitution required the king to get permission from the head of the church and the government to marry. Alexander decided to try a bold move. He went to his jailer. He went to Prime Minister Eleftherios Venizelos. The meeting between the young, love-struck king and the wily old politician must have been fascinating. Venizelos listened to Alexander's plea. Surprisingly, the prime minister didn't immediately say no. Venizelos was a master tactician. He saw a potential advantage. The Greek people were tired of foreign queens. King Constantine's wife, Sophia, was German, and that had been a disaster during the war. If Alexander married a beautiful Greek woman, a war hero's daughter, it might actually make the monarchy more popular, and, crucially, it would sever Alexander's ties to his exiled pro-German family even further. I am not opposed to it in principle, Your Majesty, Venizelos reportedly said, but the timing is wrong. Greece was still negotiating the peace treaties of World War I. The political situation was fragile. Wait, Venizelos told him, wait until the peace is signed. Wait until the election is won. Then we will discuss it. Alexander tried to wait, but patience was not his virtue. He felt life slipping away. He watched the seasons change from the window of his palace, feeling the crushing weight of his loneliness. By late 1919, he decided he was done waiting. On the evening of November 17th, 1919, a car idled quietly in the darkness of an Athens street. Inside was King Alexander. He was nervous, checking his watch. He wasn't heading to a state dinner or a military review. He was heading to the house of a man named Christos Zalokostas, a wealthy friend who had agreed to host the most secret event of the year. Inside the house, the air was thick with tension. Aspasia was there, dressed simply. There were no rows of guests, no choir, no bishops in golden vestments. The only other person present was Archimandrite Zacharistas, a priest Alexander had personally persuaded to perform the ceremony. The priest was terrified. He knew that marrying the king without the official permission of the archbishop or the government was technically illegal. It could cost him his career or worse. But Alexander was the king, and he was persuasive. He swore the priest to secrecy. In that dimly lit living room, with the curtains drawn tight against the night, King Alexander of Greece and Aspasia Manos exchanged vows. It was a morganatic marriage. This is a crucial term. It meant that while the marriage was valid in the eyes of God, it carried heavy restrictions in the eyes of the state. Aspasia would not become queen. She would not take the title Her Majesty. Any children they had would be legitimate, but they would not be in the line of succession to the throne. Alexander didn't care. He slipped the ring onto her finger. For the first time since his father had left him on the dock 2 years earlier, he felt whole. But in a city like Athens, a secret shared by 3 people is a secret shared by none. It didn't take long. The rumors started as whispers in the coffee houses, then grew into shouts in the newspapers. The priest, under pressure from the archbishop, confessed. The scandal broke like a thunderstorm. The reaction was brutal from all sides. Alexander's family in Switzerland was horrified. His mother, Queen Sophia, wrote scathing letters. She felt Alexander had debased the royal bloodline. To them, Aspasia was that woman, a social climber who had seduced their son. They refused to recognize the marriage. The government was furious. Venizelos felt betrayed. He had told Alexander to wait, and the king had disobeyed him. Venizelos stormed into the palace and threatened to abdicate, to throw the country into chaos. There was talk of stripping Alexander of the throne. There was talk of annulling the marriage, but Alexander, usually so weak, so compliant, suddenly found a backbone of steel. He told Venizelos flat out, "I will not leave her. If you want me to remain king, she remains my wife." Venizelos, ever the pragmatist, realized he was stuck. He still needed Alexander. The king was the glue holding the regime together. So, a compromise was struck. The marriage would be recognized as legal, but it would remain morganatic. Aspasia would not be queen. She would be known officially as Madame Manos. She was not allowed to accompany the king on official state duties. She could not stand beside him on the balcony. It was a humiliation for her, a public statement that she wasn't good enough. But Aspasia accepted it with dignity. She moved into a private residence and later, quietly, into the Tatoy estate. She had the man, and that was enough. As 1920 dawned, the storm clouds seemed to part. Despite the scandal of the marriage, or perhaps because of it, Alexander's popularity began to rise. The common people, hearing the rumors of his love match, found it romantic. He wasn't a stiff German prince, he was a passionate Greek boy, and on the world stage, Greece was winning. This is the moment of tragic irony. Just before the fall, the sun shines brightest. In August 1920, the Treaty of Sèvres was signed. This was Venizelos' masterpiece. It was the treaty that carved up the defeated Ottoman Empire. The terms were staggeringly good for Greece. Greece was awarded eastern Thrace and the administration of the region of Smyrna on the coast of Asia Minor. It seemed the Megali idea was becoming reality. Greek troops were marching into lands that had been lost for nearly 500 years. Alexander, as the king, was technically the head of this victorious empire. He traveled to the newly liberated territories. He rode through the streets of Adrianople and Smyrna. Crowds threw flowers. They cheered Zito o Vasilius. For a few months in the summer of 1920, Alexander wasn't just a puppet. He was a symbol of national resurrection. He was young, he was handsome, he was victorious. And he had even better news. Aspasia was pregnant. The dynasty was secure. The war was over. The country was expanding. The young couple looked forward to a future where perhaps the old hatreds of the national schism would fade away, replaced by the glory of a greater Greece. But fate is not interested in happy endings. Fate was interested in the small, seemingly insignificant details. Fate was interested in a vineyard manager named Sturm. Fate was interested in the fact that Sturm kept exotic pets. Fate was interested in the bacteria living in the mouth of a monkey. September 1920. The heat in Athens was oppressive. The dust, the noise, the constant political maneuvering. It was all too much for the expectant couple. Alexander and a pregnant Aspasia decided to retreat to Tatoy. Tatoy in the autumn is paradise. The leaves of the deciduous trees turn gold and russet against the dark green of the pines. The air is crisp. It was the perfect place to prepare for the birth of their child. They spent their days driving through the forest, organizing the nursery, and walking their dogs. Alexander's favorite dog, a German shepherd named Fritz, was always by his side. Fritz was a large, loyal, somewhat aggressive animal, trained to protect the king. It was a time of rare peace. Alexander began to think about the future. He talked of modernizing the Tatoy farm. He talked of maybe one day reconciling with his father. He felt finally like he was in control of his life, but there is a specific geography to Tatoy that we must understand for what happens next. The main palace sits on a hill. Down the slope, about a 10-minute walk away, were the administrative buildings, the stables, and the cottages for the staff. The manager of the vineyards, the German national named Sturm, lived in one of these cottages. Sturm was an eccentric character. In his garden he kept a pair of Barbary macaques, a male and a female. These were not small, playful monkeys. Barbary macaques can weigh up to 15 to 20 kilograms. They have powerful jaws and large canine teeth. They are territorial and protective. Usually they were kept tied up or caged, but on the morning of October 2nd, 1920, the female monkey was loose. She was wandering the gardens near the staff quarters, looking for food, exploring the flower beds. It was a Tuesday, a quiet, uneventful Tuesday. King Alexander finished his lunch. He put on his boots. He called for Fritz. "Come on, boy," he likely said. "Let's go for a walk." He kissed Aspasia goodbye. He told her he wouldn't be long. He walked out of the palace door, down the gravel path, the dog bounding ahead of him, sniffing the pine needles. The sun was filtering through the trees. The birds were singing. He was walking toward the vineyard manager's cottage. He was walking toward the end of his life. He had no idea that he had less than an hour of health left. He had no idea that the creature waiting in the bushes was about to bring down the Greek government, destroy the army, and burn the city of Smyrna to the ground. The stage is set. The players are in position. The tragedy is about to begin. We often imagine that the turning points of history are loud. We expect the crack of a sniper's rifle in Sarajevo, the roar of a cannon at Waterloo, or the crash of the stock market. We expect the soundtrack of history to be dramatic, but sometimes the sound of an empire collapsing is nothing more than the snapping of a twig, the bark of a dog, and the screech of an animal. We are at Tatoy Palace on the afternoon of October 2nd, 1920. King Alexander is 27 years old. He is healthy, athletic, and finally, after years of loneliness, happy. He has a pregnant wife waiting for him in the palace. He has a kingdom that has just expanded across the Aegean Sea. He has the wind at his back. He is walking down a gravel path, breathing in the scent of pine and damp earth. He is seemingly the master of his domain. But in the next 10 minutes, everything, the joy, the kingdom, the future, will be torn away by a force of pure, chaotic violence. It is difficult to overstate how strange this event is. In the long, bloody history of European royalty, kings have died in battle. They have been beheaded, poisoned, and blown up by anarchists. But no king, before or since, has been taken down by a pet. We are about to witness the fight that changed the world. The time is roughly 3 p.m. The sun is beginning its slow descent, casting long shadows through the trees of the Tatoy estate. Alexander is walking briskly. He is wearing his walking clothes, likely breeches, riding boots, and a light jacket. His German shepherd, Fritz, is off the leash. Fritz is a big dog. German shepherds are herders and guardians by nature, possessed of a high prey drive. As they near the cottage of the vineyard manager Sturm, Fritz stops. His ears prick up. He smells something musky and unfamiliar. In the garden of the cottage, the female Barbary macaque is foraging. She's outside her usual enclosure. Fritz spots her. The instinct is instantaneous. To the dog, this is an intruder, or perhaps prey. Fritz launches himself forward with a deep, throaty bark. The female monkey screams, a high-pitched, terrifying sound that echoes off the stone walls of the cottage. Alexander sees the dog bolt. He shouts, "Fritz, no, come back." But the dog is already on the monkey. It is a swirl of fur and noise. The monkey is fighting back, scratching and biting, but the dog is larger and heavier. Alexander does what any dog owner would do. He doesn't think about his title. He doesn't think about protocol. He just sees his beloved dog in a fight and runs to break it up. He isn't afraid. He is a young man in his prime, a soldier. Breaking up a dogfight is a nuisance, not a threat. He reaches the melee. He grabs Fritz by the collar, hauling the snapping dog backward. He is yelling commands, trying to de-escalate the chaos. He is focused entirely on the dog and the female monkey in front of him. He makes a fatal error. He forgets to check his flank. The commotion has alerted the male macaque. This animal is the mate of the female being attacked. He is nearby, perhaps tethered loosely, or having just broken free in his agitation. Seeing his mate in the jaws of a predator and a human, the male goes into a primal defensive rage. Barbary macaques are incredibly dense with muscle. They are not like the spindly monkeys you see in cartoons. They are fighters. The male launches himself from a tree or a wall. He hits Alexander from the side with the force of a cannonball. It happens in a blur. Alexander feels a heavy weight slam into his torso. He stumbles. The monkey doesn't just scratch, it bites, and it bites deep. The animal sinks its teeth into Alexander's left calf. The pain is sudden and sharp like a hot knife. Alexander shouts, kicking out, trying to dislodge the enraged creature. "Get off! Get off!" He manages to shake the monkey loose, but the animal is relentless. It lunges again, this time biting him higher up on the thigh. This bite is even worse. The teeth tear through the fabric of his breeches and puncture the muscle. Alexander is now fighting for his life, or at least his safety, against a whirlwind of claws and teeth. He is punching at the air, trying to protect his face. Fritz the dog is barking wildly, trying to get to the male monkey. Suddenly, servants come running. They carry sticks and brooms, shouting, chasing the monkeys back. The vineyard manager, Sturm, appears horrified and manages to corral his pets. The noise dies down. The adrenaline is still pumping. Alexander stands there panting. He looks down at his leg. His trousers are torn. There is blood, quite a lot of it, soaking into the fabric and dripping onto the gravel path. He feels a throbbing pain, but he is still standing. He checks Fritz. The dog is fine. Alexander looks at the servants, who are pale with shock. "I'm all right," he probably says, breathless. "It's just a bite." He limps back towards the palace. He doesn't call for an ambulance. He doesn't panic. It's embarrassing, really. The king of Greece, bested by a monkey. He probably plans to clean it up, put a bandage on it, and maybe laugh about it over dinner. He walks back to the palace on his own 2 feet. That was the last walk he would ever take. When Alexander reached the palace, the staff immediately fetched the royal physician. The wounds were ugly. The bites were deep puncture wounds. the kind that don't bleed freely to wash out the dirt, but instead trap bacteria deep inside the tissue. The doctors did what was standard for 1920. They washed the wounds thoroughly with water and alcohol. They grabbed a bottle of iodine, the stinging orange antiseptic that was the cure-all of the era, and cauterized the bites. They bandaged his leg. Alexander was given something for the pain, perhaps a glass of brandy or a mild sedative. The mood that evening was one of concern, but not alarm. Aspasia was shaken, fussing over him, but Alexander reassured her. He was young. He had survived the Spanish flu. He had survived the front lines of the war. A monkey bite was painful, yes, but surely not lethal. But inside the wound, a microscopic war had already begun. The mouth of a macaque is a biological weapon. It is teeming with bacteria, Streptococcus, Staphylococcus, and other virulent pathogens that thrive on decaying matter. When the monkey's teeth pierced Alexander's leg, they acted like a hypodermic needle, injecting millions of these bacteria deep into the muscle fascia, a place where oxygen is scarce and blood flow can be restricted. The iodine cleaned the surface, but it couldn't reach the bottom of the puncture. Safe and warm inside the king's leg, the bacteria began to divide. 1 became 2, 2 became 4, 4 became 16. Within hours, there were millions. By the evening of October 2nd, Alexander felt a chill. He pulled a blanket around himself, but he couldn't get warm. By the morning of October 3rd, the reality of the situation became terrifyingly clear. Alexander woke up in agony. His leg wasn't just sore, it was on fire. It was swollen to twice its normal size, the skin tight and shiny. Red streaks, the hallmark of lymphangitis, were shooting up his thigh towards his groin. He had a raging fever. His temperature spiked to 103 degrees Fahrenheit, then higher. He was sweating profusely, yet shivering uncontrollably. The doctors unbandaged the leg and recoiled. The wounds were not healing. They were oozing pus. The smell of infection, a sweet rotting odor, began to fill the room. The diagnosis was immediate and grim. Septicemia, blood poisoning. In 1920, this was a death sentence. This was the era before antibiotics. Alexander Fleming wouldn't discover penicillin until 1928, 8 years too late. There were no pills to swallow that would magically kill the bacteria. The doctors had only medieval tools, lancing the wound to drain the pus, hot compresses to try and draw out the poison, and supportive care. They were relying entirely on Alexander's immune system to fight a battle it was already losing. The king was young and strong, but the infection was aggressive. It wasn't just staying in his leg. It was dumping toxins into his bloodstream, poisoning his heart, his kidneys, his brain. As the king lay burning with fever, a different kind of sickness was taking hold in the palace corridors, political cowardice. The Venizelos government was terrified of the news getting out. Prime Minister Venizelos knew his position was fragile. An election was coming up in November. If the public found out that the young king was dying, it could cause panic. It could rally sympathy for the exiled royal family. So, they lied. The first medical bulletin issued to the press was a masterpiece of understatement. It said the king had suffered a slight indisposition due to a minor accident. Meanwhile, inside Tatoy, the situation was becoming a horror movie. Specialists were summoned from Athens. Then, as the condition worsened, experts were called in from Paris and London. These eminent men gathered around the bed of the delirious king. They argued in hushed tones in the hallway. They knew there was one drastic option left, one thing that might save his life: amputation. If they cut off his leg, high up at the hip, they could physically remove the source of the infection before it overwhelmed his vital organs. It was a brutal, disfiguring surgery, but it was the only card they had left to play. But here is where the tragedy moves from medical to political. Who had the authority to cut off the leg of a king? The doctors were terrified of liability. If they operated and the king died of shock, they would be called murderers. If they operated and he survived, they would be responsible for making the king a cripple. In the eyes of the Greek public, a king had to be physically perfect. A one-legged king might be seen as weak, unfit to lead the army. They needed permission. Normally, the next of kin would decide. That would be his wife, Aspasia. She was right there, sitting by his bed, wiping his brow. She would likely have screamed, "Cut it off, save him." But the government didn't recognize her as queen. To them, she was just Madame Manos. Her legal standing was shaky. The doctors ignored her. They needed the permission of the king's father, the exiled King Constantine. So the telegrams began to fly. The doctors cabled Switzerland. Condition critical, amputation considered, request instructions. But the communication was slow, and worse, it was filtered through the government. Venizelos didn't want to give Constantine any say in Greek affairs. He didn't want to acknowledge the exiled king's authority over his son. The response from Switzerland was fraught with confusion and delay. The parents were frantic, but they were far away. They couldn't see the leg. They couldn't see the fever. They likely couldn't believe that a monkey bite required cutting off a leg. They hesitated. And while the politicians plotted and the parents wept in exile, the doctors did nothing. They cleaned the wound. They changed the dressings. They watched the gangrene set in. By the end of the first week, the flesh around the bite was turning black. The infection had reached the bone. Alexander was slipping in and out of a coma, mumbling names, crying out in pain when they touched him. The cruelty of the situation reached its peak in the second week of October. Realizing their son was dying, King Constantine and Queen Sophia begged the Greek government for permission to travel to Athens. They wanted to be at his bedside. They wanted to say goodbye. This is a basic human right, a mother wanting to hold her dying child. Prime Minister Venizelos said no. He was cold, calculating, and utterly ruthless. He feared that if Constantine set foot on Greek soil, the royalist army officers would stage a coup. He feared the crowds would cheer for the old king. He feared losing the election. The presence of the exiled king is a threat to national security, the government declared. They denied the visa. Queen Sophia, desperate, begged for a compromise. "If the king cannot come," she pleaded, "let me come alone. I am just a mother. I will not speak of politics." Venizelos refused again. He hated Sophia. To him, she was the German woman, the sister of the Kaiser, the enemy. Finally, a small concession was made. They would allow Alexander's grandmother, the Dowager Queen Olga, to come. She was the widow of King George I. She was Russian-born, elderly, and seen as less of a political threat. Queen Olga was living in exile in Switzerland, too. She immediately packed her bags and rushed to the train station. She traveled to Italy to catch a boat to Greece, but nature conspired against her. The seas were rough. The ship was delayed, and when she finally arrived at the Greek port, the authorities, petty to the last, delayed her train to Athens with bureaucratic red tape. She was racing against time, but time had run out. By October 20th, Alexander was a shell of a human being. He had lost a massive amount of weight. His face was gaunt, his eyes sunken and bright with delirium. The sepsis had caused multiple organ failure. His kidneys were shutting down. Occasionally, he would have moments of lucidity. In those moments, he would look for Aspasia. She never left him. She slept in a chair by his bed. She was pregnant, exhausted, and watching the love of her life rot from the inside out. He would ask for his mother. "Is she coming?" he would whisper. Aspasia would have to lie. "She is on her way, my love. She is coming." He would ask about his dogs, but mostly he was lost in the hallucinations of fever. He was back in the war, or driving his car at high speed, or perhaps reliving the terror of the garden, fighting off the monkey again and again. On October 24th, the doctors issued a bulletin that finally told the truth. The king's strength is failing. The heart is weakening. The end is near. Athens went silent. The political squabbling in the cafes stopped. People gathered outside the palace gates holding candles. Even those who hated the monarchy felt the tragedy of this. A young man dying alone, separated from his parents, killed by a fluke of nature. The golden boy of the dynasty, who never wanted the crown, was now paying the ultimate price for wearing it. The infection had now consumed him entirely. The pain had likely ceased only because the nerves were dead or his brain was too foggy to register it. On the afternoon of October 25th, 1920, the breathing of King Alexander became shallow and ragged. The death rattle began. At 4 p.m., with Aspasia holding his hand, King Alexander of Greece took his final breath. The struggle was over, but as the doctors pulled the sheet over his face, they knew that the real trouble was just beginning. The king was dead. The throne was empty, and outside the gates the wolves were gathering. The body of the king was laid out in the chapel of the palace. He looked small and frail. Because of the infection, the coffin had to be sealed quickly. His grandmother, Queen Olga, arrived 12 hours too late. She walked into the silent palace, a grieving old woman in black, greeted only by the weeping Aspasia. She was the only member of his blood family to attend the funeral. They buried him at Tatoy, in the royal cemetery, just a few hundred yards from the garden where he was bitten. His tombstone is simple. It does not list his great victories, for he had none. It lists his name and his dates. But the most important legacy of Alexander was not buried with him. It was left behind in the chaos he created. Venizelos thought he could manage the transition. He thought he could just put another puppet on the throne. But he had underestimated the grief of the nation, and he had underestimated the ghost of the man he had just let die. The death of Alexander broke the dam. The elections were 3 weeks away, and the Greek people were about to deliver a verdict that would shock the world. The monkey had done its work. Now it was time for the politicians to destroy what was left. The funeral of King Alexander was a somber, muted affair. It took place on October 29th, 1920. The weather was gray and rainy, as if the heavens themselves were weeping for the absurdity of it all. The procession moved through the streets of Athens, but the crowds were confused. They were burying a king who had been a victory symbol just months before, but whose death felt like a senseless accident. There was no grandeur, no visiting heads of state from Europe. Just a lonely hearse and a family represented only by a grieving grandmother and a pregnant, unrecognized wife. When they lowered his coffin into the earth at Tatoy, they were burying more than a man. They were burying the fragile political stability of Greece. Prime Minister Eleftherios Venizelos stood by the grave, looking stoic. He had ruled Greece with an iron fist for 3 years. He had doubled the size of the nation. He had won the First World War alongside the British and French. He believed he was the savior of the Hellenic people. He looked at the grave of the 27-year-old puppet king and likely thought, this is a setback, but I can manage it. He was wrong. He didn't realize that the death of this young man had snapped the last thread holding the country's psyche together. He didn't realize that the bacteria from the monkey's mouth had already infected the body politic of Greece. We are now entering the phase of the story where the tragedy shifts from the personal to the geopolitical. We move from the sickbed to the ballot box, and from the ballot box to the battlefield. A grieving nation made a choice that felt right in the heart, but was suicidal for the state. We will see the return of an old king, the flight of a great statesman, and the cold, hard betrayal of great powers. The monkey had killed the king. Now the vacuum left behind was about to kill the kingdom. The immediate problem facing the Greek government on the morning of October 26, 1920, was simple. The throne was empty. According to the Constitution, the crown should pass to the next male heir. Alexander had no legitimate sons. The succession fell to Alexander's younger brother, the third son of King Constantine, Prince Paul. Paul was just 19 years old. He was living in exile in Switzerland with his father and older brother George. The Greek government, desperate to keep the Venizelos regime alive and keep the exiled King Constantine out, sent an urgent offer to Paul. They offered him the crown. They promised him money, power, and a return to his beloved Athens. All he had to do was say yes and step over the rights of his father and older brother. It was a tempting offer for a teenager living in a hotel in Lucerne. But Paul was made of stern stuff. He was fiercely loyal to his family. He knew that Alexander had only taken the throne under duress. Paul viewed his father, Constantine, as the legitimate king who had been illegally forced out by foreign powers. Paul sent a telegram back to Athens that hit the government like a sledgehammer. He wrote, "I cannot accept the crown. It belongs to my father, King Constantine. I will not be a usurper like my poor brother was forced to be. The throne is not vacant." It was a stunning rejection. The government was panic-stricken. They had no king. They had a dead monarch, an exiled monarch who was technically deposed, and a prince who refused to serve. Venizelos was cornered. He couldn't bring Constantine back. That would destroy his entire political platform and alienate the British and French allies. He couldn't force Paul to take the throne. So Venizelos made a gamble that would go down as one of the most spectacular miscalculations in political history. He decided to ask the people. He declared a general election for November 14th, 1920. He believed that his record spoke for itself. He had created a greater Greece. He had liberated Thrace and Smyrna. Surely the people would vote for him, and with a fresh mandate he could solve the constitutional crisis on his own terms, perhaps even declaring a republic. He was drunk on his own success. He didn't hear the angry murmurs in the villages. The election campaign of November 1920 was one of the most vicious in European history. On one side was Venizelos and the Liberal Party. Their symbol was an anchor, representing stability and the alliance with the great sea powers, Britain and France. Their slogan was essentially, "We won the war, we built the empire, trust us." On the other side was the United Opposition, a coalition of royalists, conservatives, and anyone who hated Venizelos. Their symbol was an olive branch. Their slogan was hauntingly simple, "We want the king." They didn't mean a new king. They meant the old king, Constantine, the eagle's son. But the royalists had a secret weapon in this campaign, one they used with devastating emotional effect: the death of Alexander. They spun a narrative that was powerful and tragic. They told the peasants in the mountains and the shopkeepers in Athens, "Look at how the boy died. He died alone. He died in agony. His mother was not allowed to hold his hand. His father was locked out of the country. This government is heartless. They are cruel. They that killed the son by keeping the parents away." This hit home. In Greek culture, family is everything. The image of Queen Sophia crying in Switzerland while her son died in Athens was more powerful than any map of new territories Venizelos could show them. Furthermore, the Greek people were exhausted. We have to remember Greece had been at war almost continuously since 1912. First the Balkan Wars, then the National Schism, then World War I, and now the expedition in Asia Minor. 10 years of mobilization, 10 years of sons coming home in boxes, or not coming home at all. Venizelos was promising glory, but glory is expensive. It costs blood. The royalists promised something much more attractive: peace. They campaigned on the idea that if Constantine returned, the wars would end. The army would come home. Life would go back to normal. Small but honorable Greece was better than a greater Greece that required eternal war. On election night, November 14th, 1920, Venizelos sat in his office, confident of victory. He had even invited foreign journalists to celebrate with him. As the results started coming in over the telegraph wires, the mood in the room shifted from festive to frozen. It wasn't just a loss, it was a massacre. The Venizelos party was wiped out. They lost nearly every region. Even in his home constituency of Crete, Venizelos struggled. The great statesman, the man who had redrawn the map of the Balkans, the darling of London and Paris, had been humiliatingly rejected by his own people. Shocked and bitter, Venizelos resigned immediately. A few days later, fearing for his life from vengeful royalist mobs, he boarded a private yacht and fled into exile in France. The path was clear. The monkey bite had triggered an election. The election had toppled the government. Now the door was open for the return of the king. The royalist government immediately announced a plebiscite to confirm the return of King Constantine I. The result was a foregone conclusion. Whether by genuine enthusiasm or a bit of ballot stuffing, the Greek people shouted their answer: bring him back. But in London and Paris, the reaction was cold fury. We must understand the geopolitical chessboard here. Britain and France had spent millions of pounds and thousands of lives fighting Germany in WWI. King Constantine was seen by them as a pro-German enemy. He was the Kaiser's brother-in-law. During the war, he had refused to help the Allies. To the British and French governments, the Greek vote was a slap in the face. It felt like Greece was joining the enemy after the war was won. The Allies issued a chilling diplomatic note to the new Greek government. It was a warning, stark and unambiguous. The restoration of King Constantine would be considered a ratification by the Greek people of his hostile acts during the war. In this event, the three powers reserved to themselves complete liberty in dealing with the situation. Translated from diplomatic speech, this meant, if you bring him back, you are on your own. We will cut you off. They threatened to freeze all loans. They threatened to stop sending ammunition. They threatened to withdraw their naval support. The Greek voters ignored the warning. They were riding a wave of nationalism and emotion. They thought the Allies were bluffing. They thought, they need us to hold Asia Minor against the Turks. They won't abandon us. On December 19, 1920, King Constantine I arrived in Athens. The scenes were delicious. Hundreds of thousands of people filled the streets. They unhitched the horses from his carriage and pulled it themselves to the palace. They wept. They threw flowers. It was the greatest party Athens had ever seen. Constantine stood on the balcony, looking out at the sea of adoring faces. He was vindicated. He was home. But while the champagne flowed in Athens, in the chancelleries of Western Europe, the checkbooks were snapping shut. The French government immediately halted all financial credits to Greece. The British, though more sympathetic, pulled back their support. Greece was now financially bankrupt, politically isolated, and diplomatically toxic, and they still had an army of 200,000 men deep inside Turkey, waiting for orders. This is the moment where the tragedy turns into a catastrophe. The royalists had won the election on a promise of peace. They had criticized Venizelos for his imperialist war in Asia Minor. The soldiers at the front voted for the king because they thought he would bring them home. But once Constantine and his government took power, a terrible transformation occurred. They looked at the map. They saw the fertile lands of Smyrna. They saw the dream of the Megali idea, and they got greedy. Or perhaps they were trapped. To withdraw the army now would look like a defeat. It would mean abandoning the Greek population in Asia Minor to the mercy of the Turks. It would mean admitting that all the suffering was for nothing. So the king who promised peace decided to continue the war, but he decided to fight it with one hand tied behind his back. First, the new government conducted a massive purge of the military. They fired nearly all the experienced Venizalist officers, the men who had actually led the troops to victory in World War I. They replaced them with royalist favorites. Generals who hadn't seen a battlefield in 5 years, men who were chosen for their loyalty to the crown rather than their tactical skill, were suddenly given command of corps and divisions. The new commander-in-chief was Anastasios Papoulas, a man whose primary qualification was that he was a die-hard royalist who had been in jail under Venizelos. Meanwhile, on the other side of the hill, the enemy was getting stronger every day. Mustafa Kemal was rallying the Turkish nationalist forces in Ankara. He was a military genius, a man of iron will. He saw clearly what had happened. The Greeks have lost their British masters, Kemal likely realized. They are alone. They are divided. Now is the time to strike. Kemal began to receive secret aid from the strangest of places, the Soviet Union and France and Italy. Yes, the former allies of Greece, furious at the return of King Constantine, began to make backroom deals with the Turks. France and Italy started selling arms to Kemal. They wanted the Greeks out of Asia Minor to secure their own economic interests in the region. The irony is sickening. The guns that would soon be used to kill Greek soldiers were manufactured by their former allies, the French. By the spring of 1921, the situation was grim. The Greek economy was collapsing under the weight of the war and the Allied financial blockade. The soldiers were wearing worn-out boots and using old rifles. King Constantine, aging and sick, felt he had to force a victory. He couldn't just hold the line. He needed a knockout blow to force the Turks to sign a peace treaty. So he ordered an attack. The Greek army was ordered to march out of the safety of the coastal regions, away from their supply lines, deep into the dry, scorching Anatolian plateau. Their target was Ankara, the stronghold of Kemal's rebels. It was a march into nothingness. Imagine 100,000 men walking across a salt desert in the middle of summer. The temperatures hit 40 degrees Celsius. Water was scarce. The Turkish cavalry harassed their flanks, destroying supply trucks. They were marching towards a trap. The king, the man who had been brought back to bring peace, was now leading his nation on a death march towards a mirage of glory. If Alexander were alive, this wouldn't be happening. Venizelos would still be in charge. The British would still be paying the bills. The army would likely be holding a defensive line on the coast, protected by the Royal Navy. But Alexander was dead, and so the army marched on. They reached the Sakarya River, just 50 miles from Ankara. They could almost see the minarets of the enemy capital. They fought with incredible bravery. The Battle of Sakarya lasted for 21 days of hand-to-hand combat. It was a bloodbath, but they couldn't break the Turkish line. Kemal told his troops, "There is no line of defense. There is only a surface of defense, and that surface is the whole fatherland." Exhausted, starving, and out of ammunition, the Greek army broke. They began to retreat. It was not an orderly withdrawal. It was the beginning of the end. As the winter of 1921 set in, a gloomy silence fell over the front. The Greek army dug into defensive positions, miles from home, unpaid and unloved. In Athens, the jubilation of the king's return had evaporated. The streets were filled with wounded veterans begging for money. The drachma was worthless. King Constantine was a broken man. He sat in the palace, the same palace where his son had died, and realized he had inherited a poisoned chalice. He had returned to save his country, but his very presence had doomed it. And in the distance, across the Aegean, the storm was gathering. Mustafa Kemal was building up his forces for the final offensive. He wasn't just planning to push the Greeks back. He was planning to drive them into the sea. The monkey's bite had killed a king. The election had killed the alliance. We began this story in a quiet garden with the snap of a jaw and the bark of a dog. It was a small, almost comical event, a king bitten by a pet monkey. But as we have seen, history is a domino setup. The monkey killed Alexander. Alexander's death toppled the government of Venizelos. The fall of Venizelos brought back the exiled king Constantine. The return of Constantine caused the great powers, Britain and France, to abandon Greece. Now the final domino is about to fall, and this one is not a political figure or a government. This domino is an entire civilization. We are standing in the summer of 1922. The Greek army, exhausted, unpaid, and leaderless, is stranded deep in the deserts of Turkey. The Greek people are bankrupt. The king is dying of heart disease in his palace, paralyzed by indecision, and on the horizon the storm has broken. Mustafa Kemal Ataturk has given the order. The Turkish army is coming. What follows is not just a military defeat. It is known in Greek history simply as I Mikrasiatiki Catastrophe, the Asia Minor catastrophe. It is the violent uprooting of millions of people, the burning of ancient cities, and the final bloody receipt for the accident that happened in the gardens of Tatoy. This is how the story ends, not with a whimper, but with a fire that could be seen from space. August 26th, 1922. The heat on the Anatolian plateau was suffocating. The Greek soldiers in their trenches were lethargic. They hadn't been paid in months. Their boots were falling apart. They knew their king had been abandoned by the Allies. They knew they were alone. At dawn, the Turkish artillery opened fire. It was a barrage of terrifying intensity. Mustafa Kemal had concentrated his forces on a weak point in the Greek line south of Afyon. When the Turkish infantry charged, they didn't just attack, they swarmed. The Greek defense didn't bend, it shattered. The royalist generals, appointed for their loyalty rather than their skill, lost control of the situation within hours. Communications were cut, regiments were isolated, panic, the most contagious disease in any army, began to spread. It started as a retreat, then it became a rout. Imagine 200,000 men throwing down their rifles and running. The roads back to the coast became clogged with a chaotic river of humanity. Trucks, horses, artillery pieces were abandoned in ditches. But the soldiers weren't alone. As the Greek army fled, the Greek civilian population living in the villages and towns of Asia Minor realized with horror that their shield was broken. They grabbed what they could carry, icons, photos, children, and joined the retreat. It was a race to the sea. The destination was Smyrna. Smyrna was the jewel of the Aegean. It was a cosmopolitan, wealthy city known as Infidel Izmir by the Turks because of its massive Greek and Christian population. For 3,000 years, Greeks had lived on this coast. Smyrna was more Greek than Athens. It was a city of opera houses, cafes, shipping magnates, and thriving commerce. Now it was the only lifeboat left. By early September, the city was bursting at the seams. Hundreds of thousands of refugees camped on the waterfront, the famous quay. They looked out at the harbor and saw the mighty warships of the Allied powers, British, French, American, Italian, anchored there. They felt a surge of relief. The great powers are here, they thought. "They won't let us die, they will take us away." They were wrong. The orders given to the captains of those ships were cold and clear. Maintain strict neutrality. Do not intervene. The monkey bite had done its work. The Allies viewed the Greeks not as victims, but as the aggressors who had brought back the pro-German king, Constantine. They folded their arms and watched. On September 9th, 1922, the Turkish cavalry entered Smyrna. At first, there was an eerie calm. The Turkish commander, Nureddin Pasha, issued a proclamation that order would be maintained. But the hatred built up over 10 years of brutal war was too much to contain. The looting began in the Armenian quarter. Then the killings started. The Metropolitan Bishop of Smyrna, Chrysostomus, a man who had refused to leave his flock, was dragged into the street by a mob. He was beaten, his beard torn out, and he was hacked to pieces. Then on September 13th, the wind changed direction. A fire started in the Armenian district. Historians still debate the exact details, but the consensus is that it was deliberately set to drive the remaining Christians out of the houses and towards the sea. The fire of Smyrna was an apocalypse. The city was built of wood, the streets were narrow, the wind fanned the flames into a firestorm that consumed the city block by block. The heat was so intense that the paving stones on the waterfront grew too hot to stand on. A wall of fire pushed the entire population, hundreds of thousands of screaming men, women, and children, to the very edge of the water. They were trapped between the inferno and the deep sea. The scenes described by eyewitnesses are the stuff of nightmares. People jumped into the water to escape the heat, only to drown. Luggage caught fire. Horses trampled the crowds. And just a few hundred yards away, the Allied battleships sat silently. The bands on the British ships reportedly played music to drown out the screams of the dying, so the sailors wouldn't be distressed. It was the ultimate betrayal. Eventually, under pressure from horrified sailors and junior officers, the neutrality broke. Boats were sent. A massive, chaotic evacuation began, but it was too late for tens of thousands. Smyrna was gone. The Greek presence in Asia Minor, which stretched back to the days of Homer and the Trojan War, was extinguished in a single week of fire and blood. In Athens, the news arrived not by telegraph, but by the first ships carrying the shell-shocked survivors. They brought stories of horror that would traumatize the nation for a century. The greater Greece that Venizelos had built, the empire that Alexandra had briefly reigned over, was ash. The shockwave hit Athens with the force of a physical blow. The army, or what was left of it, didn't just come home. They came home angry. A group of officers, led by Colonel Nikolaos Plastiras, staged a coup d'etat. They demanded the resignation of the government and the abdication of the king. King Constantine I, the man whose return had caused this entire diplomatic collapse, knew the game was up. He was old, sick, and now reviled as the architect of the catastrophe. On September 27, 1922, less than 2 years after his triumphant return, Constantine abdicated for the second and final time. He boarded a ship and left Greece, never to return. He died just 4 months later in a hotel room in Palermo, Italy, of a brain hemorrhage. He died a broken man, muttering about the injustice of it all. The revolutionary government in Athens wanted blood. They needed scapegoats for the disaster. In the infamous trial of the six high-ranking royalist officials, including the Prime Minister Gunaris and the Commander-in-Chief, were charged with treason. On the morning of November 15, 1922, they were driven to a wall in Goudi, on the outskirts of Athens. They were lined up and shot by a firing squad. The bloodletting was complete. The monkey had claimed its final victims, but amidst this carnage, there were two people left in the wreckage of the royal family. Two people who bore the most direct connection to the tragedy: Alexander's wife, Aspasia, and his daughter. Aspasia Manos was 5 months pregnant when Alexander died. She gave birth on March 25, 1921, to a baby girl. She named her Alexandra. The baby was the only child of the beloved tragic king, but because of the morganatic marriage, the child was legally a commoner. She was not a princess. She was just Miss Alexandra Manos. For years, Aspasia fought like a tigress for her daughter's rights. She lived in a limbo, ignored by the state, living off the charity of friends. But interestingly, as the horror of 1922 settled and the dust cleared, the Greek people began to look back on King Alexander with a deep nostalgic sadness. He was the only king associated with victory. He was the innocent one. In July 1922, just before the catastrophe, caught in a rare moment of sentimentality, King Constantine's mother convinced the king to recognize the marriage retroactively. Aspasia and Alexandra were finally given titles. Aspasia became Princess Alexandra of Greece and Denmark. The baby became Princess Alexandra. But titles don't pay the rent, and they don't cure trauma. Princess Alexandra grew up in exile. She was a sad, displaced child, always moving between hotels in London and Paris, hearing stories about the father she never knew, the handsome boy who died in the garden. Her life, too, seemed touched by the tragedy of her father. She married the exiled king Peter II of Yugoslavia. It was an unhappy marriage marked by depression and suicide attempts. She became a queen without a country, wandering Europe like a ghost of the old world. She died in 1993, and eventually she was brought back to Tatoy. She was buried near her father Alexander and her mother Aspasia. Finally, the family was reunited in the soil of the estate where it all began. When we stand back and look at the mosaic of this story, the pattern is terrifying. If you visit the Tatoy estate today, it is a ruin. The palace was abandoned for decades, damaged by time and wildfires. The gardens where Alexander walked his dog are overgrown with weeds. The graves are there, quiet under the pine trees. It is a peaceful place now. You would never guess that the end of the Ottoman Empire, the birth of modern Turkey, the displacement of 1.5 million people, and the death of tens of thousands started right here, on a patch of grass. Winston Churchill, in his History of the Era, the World Crisis, dedicated a passage to this specific event. His words serve as the perfect epitaph for our story. He wrote, "It is perhaps no exaggeration to remark that 250,000 persons died of this monkey's bite. It is a statement that stops you cold. We like to believe we are in control. We vote, we sign treaties, we draw maps. We think history is made by great men in great rooms. But the story of King Alexander teaches us a humbler, darker lesson. It teaches us that history is chaos. If Alexander had worn thicker trousers, if he had leashed his dog, if the gardener had locked the cage properly, if any one of those tiny things had been different, Venizelos would have stayed in power. The alliance with Britain would have held. The Greek army would likely have consolidated its position. The fire of Smyrna might never have happened. The map of the Middle East would look completely different today. Alexander wanted to be a man of the modern age. He loved machines, speed, and breaking tradition. He didn't want to be a king. He wanted to be free. In the end, he was killed by nature, by a bite from the ancient primal world he tried to ignore. And in dying, he proved that no matter how powerful the empire, no matter how brilliant the prime minister, and no matter how brave the army, we are all, in the end, at the mercy of the smallest, most absurd twists of fate. The king is dead. the city is burned, and the monkey screeches in the garden of history forever.